If there is one personality in history who most symbolizes the qualities of faith and obedience, it is the biblical figure of Abraham. And yet, ironically, this figure, who so represented trust, was himself the source of much doubt for many years. Some were not sure how factual the accounts of Abraham's life were, and still others believed he himself was just a legend. Part of the problem, of course, was that he lived almost 4,000 years ago, and for a long time there was little information on this period. Of the 100 great people included in this program, it is Abraham who is the most ancient. He lived probably between 1800 and 1500 BC, when the Western world was made up of many tribes and kingdoms, which history has pieced together mostly from archaeological finds. It was the time of Hammurabi, the famous king of Babylonia, who set out the laws of his empire in the first of all legal systems. It was the period in which the great Persian Empire saw its beginnings, and in which Egypt reached the height of its power and achievements. Egyptians created their alphabet of 24 hieroglyphic characters, constructed an irrigation system on the Nile, and built their first tomb in the historic Valley of the Kings. In Europe it was the Bronze Age, and in Britain they were building Stonehenge, an ancient center of worship, the ruins of which can still be seen today. What we know of Abraham we know mostly from the Bible, and even then scholars doubted for years the authenticity of some of his story. For a while they believed these narratives were written over 1,000 years after Abraham lived, in the 6th to 5th centuries BC, and that the writers had projected their own contemporary concerns and situations into his life. Many even thought that Abraham and other so-called patriarchs of the Bible were mythical figures, or the personification of other tribal and folklore figures that were created to explain social and cultural patterns. But all that changed after World War I. After the war, archaeologists discovered many monuments and documents which date back to the period of Abraham, as specified in the traditional accounts of his life. One of the most important finds occurred with the excavation of a royal palace at Mari, an ancient city on the Euphrates in what is now Iraq. In the palace were thousands of cuneiform tablets. The word cuneiform refers to the wedged-shaped characters in many ancient Sumerian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian inscriptions. These particular tablets included official archives, correspondence, and religious and legal texts. Their contents showed that in the biblical book of Genesis, which includes the story of Abraham, the narratives fit perfectly with accounts of what was happening in the 2nd millennium BC, when Abraham was said to live. But they do not fit in with what was happening in the later period, when scholars thought the work had been written and adapted for the times. The unearthing of these spectacular documents was termed by one biblical scholar the rediscovery of the Old Testament. Now there were two sources for reconstructing the figure of Abraham. One was the book of Genesis, starting in chapter 11, which tells how Abraham's father, Terah, migrated to a new land, up to the death of Abraham himself in chapter 25. The other is the archaeological records of the time and place in which Abraham's story takes place. The discoveries of ancient records were greeted with so much excitement because the story of Abraham is an important one, with all kinds of religious, cultural, and even political implications. He is revered by several religions. Muslims consider him an ancestor of the Arabs, and the first in line of prophets that led to Muhammad, who is his spiritual descendant. Christians too recognize him as a spiritual ancestor, and consider him a model of the person of faith. And perhaps most importantly, Abraham is considered the founder of Judaism, the patriarch of the 12 tribes of Israel, the father of the Israelites. He is one of the few figures that plays a part in the teachings of each of these three great religions, and it's easy to see why. The story of Abraham is filled with inspiring lessons about devotion and trust in God, which challenge people to consider their own strength of faith, be it in God or any higher purpose. In his early life, Abraham was simply called Abram, which means God is exalted. Later, when he'd been told that his descendants would people the Promised Land, it was changed to Abraham, the father of many nations. He was a shepherd, born in the city of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia, now southeastern Iraq. Ur was one of the world's first cities. It was located on the Euphrates River near the Persian Gulf, where it thrived as a commercial center and port for about 1,600 years. So powerful was Ur that most of the surrounding communities came under its control, and it developed into a strong city-state. Then it extended its control to a vast empire that stretched from Assyria in the northwest to Elam in the southeast, an area that today covers parts of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Later, the course of the Euphrates River shifted, and with it, Ur's fortunes. By the time Abraham was born, Ur was in its decline. The people of Ur, like most people in those times, worshipped many gods, their favorite being the moon god. But Abram was an exception. He believed in only one God, whose name was Yahweh. By the time Abraham's story begins, he is already 75 years old, but it could be said that he was barely in the prime of his life. For Abraham, according to the Bible, lived to be 175 years old. He had a wife named Sarah, who had been his half-sister before they married. In ancient times, marriage to blood relatives was a common and practical arrangement. Sarah was barren and had been unable to give Abraham any children. According to Genesis, God told Abraham to leave Mesopotamia and journey to a new unnamed land, where he would found a new nation. He obeyed unquestioningly, and with Sarah, his brother's son Lot, their possessions, servants, and herds, they traveled west. The caravan stopped at many places, pitching their tents, grazing their herds, and then moving on, following the best pastures. They always remained shepherds and never became cultivators. Eventually, they arrived in the land of Canaan, the area between Syria and Egypt that is now Israel. It was here that Abraham felt the divine inspiration to settle and begin a community. Once in Canaan, Abraham received repeated promises and a covenant, or special agreement from God, that Abraham's children would inherit the land and become a numerous nation. To seal the covenant, God changed his name from Abram to Abraham, father of many nations. He promised him fame, land, and descendants if only he would follow God's will. This was difficult for Abraham to understand, since he had no children, and it seemed likely he never would. Nevertheless, he built an altar at the place he'd heard God speak to him, and patiently awaited his destiny. Later, a severe famine swept through Canaan, and Abraham took Sarah south to Egypt. As they were about to enter Egypt, however, he became fearful that when the Egyptians saw how beautiful Sarah was, they would kill him so they could take possession of her. He asked Sarah to say instead that she was his sister, and she readily agreed to save his life. When they entered Egypt, it was just as Abraham expected. The men of Pharaoh's court reported to him about this beautiful new stranger, and he requested she be brought to the palace. When he saw Sarah, Pharaoh had her placed in his harem. Because of his admiration for her, Pharaoh saw to it that Abraham was treated well, more than well, royally even. He was given sheep, oxen, donkeys, camels, menservants, and maidservants. Pharaoh made Abraham rich. The arrangement seemed to be working well for everyone, except the one party who hadn't been consulted, and that was God himself. Displeased with the idea that the wife of his chosen Abraham was living in the house of Pharaoh, God sent great plagues upon the house. When Pharaoh found out why, he sent for Abraham and said, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Here is your wife. Take her and go away." With that, he commanded his men to escort Abraham and Sarah and all their new possessions out of Egypt. Abraham had now become rich in cattle, silver, and gold, as had his nephew Lot. They had so many flocks and herds and tents that they found there wasn't enough space for both of them in one place. To make matters worse, the herdsmen of Abraham's flocks were quarreling with Lot's herdsmen. Abraham was a man of peace, and the quarreling distressed him. So he came up with a plan. He proposed to Lot that they each go separate ways in the wide open land before them, and that Lot could have the first choice of where to settle. Lot looked up and saw before him the plains of the river Jordan, green and fertile like the lands of Egypt. He made his choice, and the two parted company. Lot went east and pitched his tents on the plain, and Abraham and Sarah stayed in Canaan. Although the plains Lot chose were wet and fertile, he couldn't have made a worse choice. When he set up his tents, he chose a site outside a city named Sodom. And Sodom at the time was not exactly one of the Lord's favorites, and neither was its neighboring city of Gomorrah. Both were known then, as they are to this day, for the debauchery and sinfulness of their residents. By now, Abraham was a wealthy chieftain, but still he had no son. After Lot had departed, God spoke to Abraham again. Look around you. Look north and south and east and west. All the land that you can see I will give to you and your children and their children forever. I shall make your descendants as numerous as the grains of the dust on the earth. If a man could count the dust, he could count the number of your descendants. Abraham wanted to believe this. He truly wanted to believe his Lord, but he couldn't understand how it could be. He had no children, and both he and his wife were aged. Where would these descendants come from? Then he heard God say, "You shall have a son." And Abraham, without understanding how it was possible, believed him. It was Sarah who came up with the first solution to the problem of descendants. Following a custom of the time, she suggested that Abraham should sleep with her young Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. Perhaps they could get a son by her. Abraham did take Hagar into his tent, and just as Sarah had hoped, the slave girl became pregnant. But what Sarah didn't foresee was that Hagar, once she was carrying Abraham's child, felt herself superior to Sarah. When Sarah complained of this injustice to Abraham, he responded that since Hagar was Sarah's slave, Sarah should feel free to handle the matter however she liked. As a result, Sarah began to treat the girl more and more harshly, until finally Hagar ran away into the desert. There in the desert, Hagar rested by a spring. The Bible says an angel appeared to her and remarked, "You are Sarah's slave. Where do you think you are going?" When Hagar explained that she was fleeing from her mistress, the angel told her to go back. He then told her also about the son she would soon bear. He said he would be a wild soul, who would war with everyone. Even he and his brothers would be enemies. But the Lord will so multiply your children and your children's children, there will be too many to count. Hagar did as she was told and returned to Sarah. Soon Hagar gave birth to a son who was named Ishmael, which means God saw my misery. It is Ishmael from whom the Arabs believe they are descended. When Ishmael was 14 years old, Abraham once again heard the voice of God reinstating the covenant, promising to make Abraham great, asking him to walk in the way of the Lord and to strive to be perfect. As a sign of this covenant, he commanded that all of the males in Abraham's community be circumcised. Then he made a comment that Abraham again found almost too incredible to believe. He told him there would be another child from which multitudes, kings, and a great nation would spring. Abraham fell to the ground before God, but in his heart he laughed. He was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, and they were going to have a child. Instead, he asked the Lord if it weren't possible to let his son Ishmael live in his favor. Couldn't it be Ishmael from whom these nations could arise? God said that he would indeed make Ishmael a great nation, but still there would be another. The following year, Sarah too would bear him a son, whom he was to name Isaac. It was with Isaac whom God intended to make his everlasting covenant, and with Isaac's children and their children after. Once again, in spite of his doubts, Abraham put his faith in his God and assumed that somehow there would be a son. Later, God made the same promise again, this time on a visit to Abraham with 2 angels, all of them appearing as men. Abraham ran into the tent and told Sarah to quickly make them the finest cakes she could. Then he chose the most tender calf to be cooked, and he sent for butter and cream. As his holy guests dined, he himself stood under a tree and watched. Sarah was listening when God once again renewed his promise that she would have a son, and like Abraham had, she laughed silently inside. She was a worn-out older woman, and her husband too was old. It was unimaginable. God chastised her for laughing, and Sarah, frightened, claimed that she hadn't laughed. It was pointless to try to deceive God, for he promptly responded, "Nay, but thou didst laugh." And God asked, "Is anything too hard for the Lord? Sarah shall have a son." As God was preparing to depart that day, he wondered to himself if he should reveal another of his plans to Abraham, a plan he knew would cause him anguish. It involved the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham's nephew Lot was still living in Sodom. Finally, God decided he would confide in Abraham. He told Abraham that a great outcry had reached him over the wickedness of these cities. If the reports were as bad as they sounded, he would have to destroy them. If not, he would spare them. Now began the negotiations. "Will you destroy both the wicked and the good?" asked Abraham. "What if there are 50 good men in the city? Will you still destroy it? Could you judge so unjustly and kill them all, as if there were no difference between goodness and wickedness?" God replied that if he could find 50 good men, he would spare the entire city. Apologizing for his brashness, Abraham then asked God if he would spare the city if he could find 45 good men, and again God said yes, he would spare it. What about 40? Asked Abraham. Yes, he would spare it for 40. Begging God not to get angry with him, Abraham then pleaded for mercy if there were 30 good men, and God granted that too. What if you found only 20? Persisted Abraham. God answered that he would not destroy the city if he found 20 good men. Finally, Abraham begged permission to say just one more thing, and then he asked, what if there are only 10? The response once more was yes. He would spare the city for 10 good men. With that, he departed for Sodom, and Abraham returned to his tent. That evening, 2 angels who appeared as men arrived in Sodom, and Lot, who lived just inside the city gates, invited them into his home. He served them food and drink, but just as they were about to retire for the night, the men of Sodom, old as well as young, surrounded the house and demanded that Lot turn the strangers over to them so that they could molest them. Lot went outside and appealed to the mob to give up their wicked thoughts, but his words had little effect. In desperation, the Bible says, he even offered them his own 2 virgin daughters in hopes they would accept and leave the agents of God unmolested. This only made the crowd angrier. Soon they began threatening Lot too, promising to do worse things to him than they did to his visitors. At this point, the angels reached their hands out, drew Lot back inside, and barred the door. Those outside were suddenly blinded, and try as they might, none could locate the door. Finally, they returned to the city. Now the angels told Lot that he must gather up his family and take them away, because they had been sent to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. As the sun rose, the 2 men were still urging Lot to leave, and Lot was still resisting. Finally, they took him, his wife, and their 2 daughters by the hands and led them outside the city gates. There they told them to flee across the plains to the mountains and not to look back. As soon as Lot and his family were a safe distance from the city, fire and brimstone, also known as sulfur, rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities and all who lived in them were destroyed. Unable to resist her curiosity, Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. That same morning, Abraham rose early and looked across the plain to where Sodom and Gomorrah were. He saw black smoke rising in the air, like the smoke that rises from an oven. God had been unable to find even 10 good men, and he had kept his vow. Returning to the account of Abraham and Isaac, there was another vow God kept too. Sarah did conceive and give birth to a son, whom Abraham named Isaac, as commanded. In keeping with the covenant, he circumcised Isaac when he was 8 days old. Abraham himself was 100 years old and a new father. The child grew and was weaned, at which time Abraham had a great feast and celebration. As was mentioned, it was at this event that Sarah began to worry. She looked over and saw Ishmael, Abraham's son by the slave girl Hagar, laughing and playing. Now that Sarah had her own son, Ishmael ceased to look like an innocent young child to her. She told Abraham the boy and his mother must be sent away, for she would never have the son of a slave sharing in the inheritance of her own true child. Abraham, who was fond of Ishmael, was saddened by Sarah's request. At first he hesitated, but then God spoke to him again, telling him not to grieve for the boy or the woman, and to do as Sarah had asked him. So the next morning Abraham rose early, took bread and a flask of water to Hagar and her son, and sent them away. Hagar wandered about the desert of Beersheba, alone and in despair. When the water in the flask was gone, she laid Ishmael down under the shade of a bush, and sat at a distance from him because she couldn't bear to watch her son die. Then she began to weep. The voice of the crying child reached God, who sent an angel down to Hagar. The angel told Hagar not to be afraid, to get up and take the child by the hand. The child, he said, would be made into a great nation. When Hagar looked up, suddenly she saw before her a well of water. She filled the flask and gave it to Ishmael to drink. Ishmael grew up in the desert, became a great archer, married an Egyptian woman, and had the children who were the beginnings of the nation God had promised to Hagar. By this time, Abraham had fulfilled every request God had made of him. He had left Ur and settled in Canaan as directed. He had circumcised his sons, and the males among him as prescribed by the covenant. When told to do so, he had sent his first son away into the desert, and he had lived a virtuous and devout life, as God had requested of him. But Abraham's biggest test was yet to come. After he sent Hagar and Ishmael away, Abraham was approached by God again, and this time he had a command unlike any he'd given before. "Take your son," he said, "the one you love, Isaac, and offer him to me as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you." The next morning Abraham called for 2 of his servants to come with him. Then he beckoned for Isaac. They chopped the wood needed for a burnt offering and set out to find the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day of their travels, Abraham saw a mountain which he knew was the one God spoke of. He told his servants to stay below while he and Isaac went above to worship. Then he took the wood for the offering and laid it across Isaac's shoulders. The coals for the fire and the knife he carried in his own hands. Together, father and son walked towards the mountain. "My father, here am I, thy son," Isaac suddenly said. "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham responded, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering." They walked on until Abraham came to the place where he felt he should build the altar. He arranged the wood, and then he bound his son and placed him on top of it. Finally, Abraham stretched out his hand with a knife in it and prepared to sacrifice Isaac to God. At that moment, his hand raised in midair, Abraham heard the voice of God calling him, "Abraham, Abraham." God then told him not to kill Isaac, not to do him any harm, for he had proven his obedience with his willingness to sacrifice his only son. Even that, his most precious possession, he would not have denied God. When Abraham looked up, he saw a ram whose horns were entangled in the thicket behind him. He took the ram and offered it as a sacrifice on the altar, in place of his child. When that was done, God made another promise. Because Abraham had not denied him his only son, he said he would bless him and make him as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. He said Abraham's children would inherit the cities of their enemies, and their nations of the earth would be blessed. Then he was gone, and Abraham, with Isaac beside him, walked back down the mountain and returned home. Sarah died in the city of Hebron in Canaan when she was 127 years old. Abraham, who was in Beersheba at the time, came to mourn and weep for her. When he rose from beside her deathbed, he asked, since he was a stranger in the land, where he might bury his wife. It was agreed that he could purchase a field, in which there was a cave Abraham had seen that he thought would be most suitable. He placed Sarah in the cave, in this field near Hebron, which became a burial place for his people. Abraham now was a very old man, and he was starting to lose his strength. He had been blessed with everything God had promised him, but there was one matter that still concerned him, and that was the marriage of his son Isaac. The great nations God had promised could never happen until Isaac married and had children. Abraham sent a servant to find a wife for Isaac from his own people in his own country of Mesopotamia, and told him he would be guided by an angel in his search. The servant returned to Mesopotamia, to the town of Haran. When he saw the women emerging at evening to fetch water from the well, it came to him that whichever woman gave him water for himself and his camels would be the woman who was Isaac's wife. He had barely completed this thought when a beautiful girl named Rebekah, who was the granddaughter of Abraham's brother, approached the well and filled her jug. The servant approached her and asked her for a drink, and she willingly obliged. Then she offered to fetch water for his camels as well. The servant knew he had found Isaac's wife. After bringing gifts to her family and making proper arrangements, the servant brought Rebekah back to Canaan, where she married Isaac. Isaac loved Rebekah, and she him. Eventually they had twin boys, whom they named Esau and Jacob, and the nations Abraham had been promised had been born. Abraham had accomplished all he had hoped, and all that had been commanded by his God. He died contented at age 175, and was buried in the cave in the field with his wife Sarah, in the West Bank area of what later became Palestine. The field was the first clear ownership of a piece of the Promised Land by Abraham and his people. That is the story of Abraham, as told in the Bible. Of course, the story doesn't really stop there. It is instead a beginning of a long and ancient line of descent that is sacred to both Hebrews and Muslims. It is Ishmael, Abraham's son by the servant girl Hagar, whom Muslims consider to be their ancestor. To Jewish people, it is Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob, who are their patriarchs or fathers. The four matriarchs, or mothers of the Jewish people, are Sarah, Abraham's wife, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, and Leah and Rachel, Jacob's two wives. Abraham's son Jacob, the one also known as Israel, had 12 sons, and in the early part of their history, the Hebrews were organized into groups based on their descent to one of these sons. They were called the 12 tribes of Israel, or Israelites. Later, according to the Bible, God gave the Israelites the 10 Commandments and other laws through their leader Moses. These laws became the basis of their beliefs, traditions, and communities. The God of Abraham was transcendent, powerful, enduring, and omniscient. He was a personal God, too, who had intimate personal communications with individuals. This was the God of the fathers, who became the God of Abraham's son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, and those who followed them right up to the present. Abraham has enormous significance in terms of the cultural identity and spiritual heritage of two religions. But his story has significance to all people, no matter what religion or race. Abraham is a symbol of faith, the ultimate example of complete devotion to God. But he's also very human. The Bible portrays Abraham as a man struggling to fulfill God's promises and to understand and accept what he's been told. He is also a man attracted to the idea of his own fame and posterity, and a man who allows his wife to enter the harem of the Pharaoh to protect his own life, possibly because he saw God's purpose in that life. He appears to be a man of both spiritual depth and strength and human weaknesses and needs. Yet so trusting and obedient was he that he was willing to sacrifice his own son, whom he loved and for whom he'd waited patiently for years, to the higher being he believed and communed with. That one act, more than any, has been associated with Abraham for almost 4,000 years, for it is an act most can barely imagine, and serves as a symbolic universal measure of trust in divine will.